The unthinkable has happened, and Riot has released a practice mode tool for its player base, and it's great news overall. I want to take a look at it from the perspective of the competitive scene and see where it might help out there. Now, I've always been super vocal about wanting a practice tool. When I was still coaching Team Liquid, I did a pretty popular interview with Travis where I called out the need for one. And this was, around the time that shortly after that, there was that ridiculous ass backwards reasoning out of Riot about why they didn't want a sandbox mode for its player base, and it was something that always kind of peeved me. Team practice sucks. I always hated it in the sense that you don't practice anything else the way you practice League of Legends, where people are, to this day, are still scrimming, from start to finish, a 3-hour block, which consists of usually like 3 scrims with like a VOD review, and that's how they practice. And it's there's very minimal drills and collaborations between teams. The drills are basically, you're going to be looking at, doing something like some one-on-ones and maybe some basic laning stuff, collaborations. I mean, people really don't do these in terms of like, oh, let us practice late game. It's more like, don't pick this thing. We're trying to practice this matchup. Can you play that? Like, that's about as far as collaborations really go between teams. And, it's hard to fault teams for thinking that way because it's really hard to get another team who's somewhere else remote, on the same page about exactly what you want to do and what they want you to do, and there's this give and take. And so most of the time people just resort to scrimming regularly. But I mean, the practice tool is here now, right? So it should fix some stuff. But honestly, from the competitive standpoint, the tool is very underwhelming. It doesn't help with a lot of stuff. And before I get into the negative, though, I want to applaud Riot for their overall decision making in releasing the tool. And I want to especially highlight the closing paragraphs mindset where they're talking about they just wanted to get the tool out, even though it's not exactly what they want in its final state. It needs a lot of polish and probably a couple more features and things like that. But I'm really happy to see this out of Riot because they've had this mentality that has kind of, I don't want to say the word plagued, but been around for a long time, where they view themselves as like a premium game and esport and all this kind of stuff. And they are, which definitely they are. They're one of the biggest games in the world, biggest esport in the world. And as such, they don't want to put out something that they feel is like below their quality bar. And I understand that they want to put out the very best, but I've heard of a lot of like cool stuff that's kind of been shot down just because it didn't quite hit what they think is like their quality bar. And it feels like overall Riot plays things really, really safe when the community, I think, would be a little bit more accepting of some hiccups along the way, as opposed to trying to put out everything perfectly from the get-go. And there's been a ton of features from Riot that the player base has been asking for forever, and the Riot wants to do it their way, and the player base is just kind of left with nothing instead of version 0.8. And I think it's really nice to see them take the other approach with the sandbox tool here. Even though it's taken a while to get here, they're not sitting on this thing waiting till it's perfect before putting it out there. They're just kind of like, here, we need this. A lot of players want it. Let's just get it out there and prove it from there. And so overall, very happy that they decided to release it. But like I said, from the competitive standpoint, it doesn't do a ton. It allows for a lot of individual practice. So you can practice your last hitting, combos, jungle pathing, like comboing dragon, I guess. I don't know, like random stuff like that. And that's great for the average player. I think that it's a huge tool for people who aren't at the pro level yet and can improve in a lot of different ways. Because honestly, most of us suck at individual elements in League of Legends, and we can use this to improve, myself included, many players. But in terms of high level gameplay, it doesn't have a ton of use. I'm sure a lot of people will use it to test out item builds, maybe a little bit, and get familiar with the champion's mechanics. But after that, it's not going to be like a huge thing. Where I see it used most likely is in warm-ups for the LCS. Now, when teams go to the LCS, they usually want to warm up a little bit, and that is usually in the form of solo queue, a one-on-one matchup that you think you're going to play that day against a teammate or maybe another player on another team who you're not playing that day. And then there's like hand warmers where you take a certain champion and perform kind of like their bread and butter combo. And so an example would be Xpecial would practice Flash Alistar WQs all the time before the LCS if there's any chance he was going to play Alistar. It was just like a way to get that timing down. But it was a 5-minute cooldown on Flash. Then he just ran around the map for 5 minutes WQing other stuff. And basically it was just such a waste of time. And I think Dom did the same thing with Lee Sin insects and stuff like that. And just being able to spawn a dummy and practice that kind of stuff in the game before you go on stage on some champion you think you're going to play is huge. I shouldn't say huge, but useful. Useful is really all that it is. And I assume that that's honestly where this tool might see the most value in the competitive scene in its current state. And the reason I say that is because there's a huge issue with it because you can't use it in multiplayer. It's only a single player tool, which is pretty tragic because the most difficult things to get down in League of Legends are the kinds of things that require your teammates. That's why I honestly think it's such a good game, is because it's so teamwork dependent, and this tool doesn't let you do that stuff. And I understand you can say this tool is to work on your individual stuff, and that's fine, but I would like to see the tool become a little bit more powerful, and we can use it for the multiplayer aspects of the game as well. And I mean, even for single player stuff, it's pretty useful to have multiplayer things like leashing jungle camps, practicing timing your smite damage. That kind of stuff is all useful as well. And I mean, there's just situations in late game that people really don't get much practice for. I mean, like when I coached, it was pretty common to get through like an entire, week of scrims. That's 4 to 5 days, 2 3-hour blocks every single day, and get into a handful. Like I can count on one hand the amount of late game team fight situations or barons that we would get into. And we were a team that we could actively identify like, hey, our barons, we're not great around it. Let's try and practice that more. But like I said, the collaborations are really hard to do. So you're hoping that somehow the game goes longer than 27 minutes and hasn't snowballed out of control because you're playing in this scrim environment where, generally speaking, people play a little less controlled, a little looser. So you really don't get into a ton of situations like that. Some teams have put self-enforced rules like, oh, we can't end the game or we can't take an inhibitor until we take a baron. I think that was CLG who did that. And there's that kind of stuff, but it's so clunky to work into a scrim set in a natural way that a lot of people don't do it. And that's where this tool would be fucking amazing if we could literally just just go into a team fight and then, okay, everyone's back up. Let's do that team fight again. That didn't feel right or whatever. You can just grind team fight after team fight. And a lot of pro players are really bad at late game team fighting. And it's not really their fault. I mean, it's just like if you compare their laning phase, which is something people have consistently said matches up to Korean standards compared to their team fighting where we're weakest, it's like you can't even target the part that you're particularly bad at with the current ways that you practice. And even without multiplayer, or even when multiplayer gets added, there's a couple other things that the game or the tool needs. There's currently, as far as I can tell, no way to respawn Baron and no way to respawn turrets, which are the two biggest objectives that you play around in the late game, with Elder Dragon being the other one, which is a little weird. I mean, even coming out from just the competitive standpoint, I think people want to practice that kind of stuff, sieging, taking turrets, inhibs, forcing barons, vision control, that kind of stuff is all really interesting and important, even outside the pro player community, and it's something that you can't practice with this tool, even if they implement in multiplayer. So there's a couple degrees that need to get improved on before this is, I think, the dream tool that everyone wants. And I mean, it's nice that it's here, and it's definitely a step in the right direction, but it is lacking some of the core features that the pro player community wants. But like I said, overall, I'm super excited to see the progress on it, but not necessarily with where it's at right now. Even if they can't get the Baron resing and the turrets reviving, right away, just making it multiplayer is a massive step in the right direction and helps people improve so much at late game. And I've only can think of 2 reasons for why it wouldn't be. One is technically it's impossible to make it multiplayer. Which, maybe that's the case. I am a programmer. I was a programmer in college at least, and I always hate reading things from the community where it's just well, why don't they just do this, with no understanding of if that's possible in the real world or how the code will work. A great example of that would being show what dragons are going to spawn in the client, and it's wait, you'd have to recode how the entire game processes spawning dragons most likely. That's not in the client, that's in the game when it launches. That was something that always tilted me when I saw that. Anyways, tangent. So I don't want to go out and say that they can make this multiplayer no problem, but assuming they can, I hope they do. I understand that making this in a single player environment and releasing it for people to use and then making it work in multiplayer is 2 totally different worlds. So I'm happy they just put out the single player one and said, well, wait on multiplayer. But they haven't said wait on multiplayer. They're working on it. They just said it's a single player tool, which makes me concerned that they're not even trying to make it multiplayer. And the reason for that I've kind of heard is that they don't want to end up with a situation with like used map settings going on in the custom games area. And I understand the concern. We've heard it out of Riot before about fracturing the user base. They've talked about it, with regards to Dominion and threes, ARAMs. Like, they don't want to make too many game modes and spread the player base out too much, which, like I said, I understand, but that's like a negative way to look at it, because you can also say, no, it's going to grow the game because we're going to engage players in new ways and give them things that they want to do and create new communities and like all this kind of stuff. And you can kind of spin it both ways, and neither really feels like super compelling for like the outcome of what the practice tool would be, especially when you consider the actual benefits of it in terms of improving the competitive scene and players overall being able to focus on improving stuff that they want to. So I just feel like that whole argument as a whole is pretty weak and like very fear driven rather than like upside driven. So I don't know. It just doesn't feel like a very legitimate reason to me to not push this amazingly powerful tool to where it should be. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Overall, the tool is really awesome for plebs. Not so much for pros right now, though I hope they continue to improve it and eventually get it to that place where it is this tool that everyone's always dreamed of. And until that time, you got to be happy with what's come out. And I especially like the new mindset that Riot kind of showed with this tool. So that's it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, like, all that garbage, whatever. See you later.